Alfonso Cahero, A Journey into Finance History. Chapter 61, U.S.-China Trade War 2018. Tariffs and trade barriers between the two largest economies created global economic tensions. It was a sunny morning in January 2018, but the economic horizon was clouded with uncertainty. Washington, D.C. buzzed with anticipation as President Donald Trump prepared to sign a series of executive orders. Inside the Oval Office, the air was thick with a sense of impending confrontation. Advisors whispered among themselves, analyzing the potential repercussions of what was about to unfold. President Trump, with his trademark resolute expression, leaned over the resolute desk and signed the first of many documents that would mark the beginning of a historic trade war. The target was clear: China, the rising economic powerhouse. For years, the United States had watched as China's economic influence grew, feeling the sting of what they perceived as unfair trade practices, intellectual property theft, and a growing trade deficit. Outside, reporters scrambled to get their stories straight. Headlines were being crafted with words like tariffs, trade barriers, and economic showdown. The first move was a sweeping tariff on imported solar panels and washing machines, seemingly innocuous items, but symbolic of a broader strategy. The message was clear: the United States was ready to play hardball. Across the Pacific, in the sprawling cityscape of Beijing, the reaction was swift and equally resolute. President Xi Jinping, a leader known for his calm yet firm demeanor, convened an emergency meeting with his top economic advisors. China had been preparing for such a moment, aware of the growing tensions. The room was filled with seasoned diplomats, economists, and military strategists, all pondering the same question: how to respond without escalating the situation into a full-blown economic crisis. The Chinese government issued a measured but stern response. They condemned the U.S. tariffs as a blatant act of protectionism and a violation of international trade norms. Behind the scenes, plans were being drawn up to retaliate in kind. It wasn't just about the tariffs, it was about asserting China's place on the global stage. As the day drew to a close, the world watched in anticipation. Financial markets trembled, and analysts speculated on the potential fallout. In boardrooms and government offices across the globe, the realization dawned that the economic landscape was about to change dramatically. The first shots of the U.S.-China trade war had been fired, setting the stage for a conflict that would reverberate across the world. The stakes were high, and the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty. The coming months would see a series of strategic moves and counter-moves as the two largest economies on the planet clashed in a high-stakes game of economic chess. And as the battle lines were drawn, it became clear that this was more than just a trade dispute. It was a contest for global supremacy, one that would shape the future of international relations for years to come. With the first wave of tariffs in place, President Trump and his team were already strategizing their next move. The White House was abuzz with activity as advisors and trade representatives gathered to discuss the evolving situation. Trump, a businessman at heart, viewed the trade war through the lens of negotiation. For him, it was all about leverage. "Trade wars are good and easy to win," he famously tweeted, a statement that would echo through the corridors of power. His approach was bold and unorthodox, characterized by a belief that the United States could outlast and outmaneuver its rival through sheer economic might. Robert Lighthizer, the U.S. trade representative, was a key player in this unfolding drama. A seasoned negotiator with a reputation for being tough, Lighthizer was tasked with implementing Trump's vision. His strategy was to target industries where the U.S. held a competitive edge and where China's practices were most egregious. The next round of tariffs would focus on steel and aluminum, commodities critical to both nations' industrial bases. Meanwhile, in Beijing, the Chinese government was also crafting its response. They knew that their economic growth had been fueled by exports, and tariffs could severely impact their economy. But they also understood that they had significant leverage of their own. China was the largest holder of U.S. debt, a position that gave them considerable influence. Vice Premier Liu He, a trusted advisor to President Xi and an architect of China's economic policies, was appointed to lead the negotiations. Liu was known for his pragmatic approach and deep understanding of both Western and Chinese economic systems. He sought to find a path that would de-escalate tensions while safeguarding China's interests. As the two sides prepared for the first round of direct talks, the atmosphere was tense. The negotiations were set to take place in Washington, D.C., a symbolic location chosen by the U.S. to assert its home ground advantage. The Chinese delegation arrived with a carefully crafted message of cooperation, but also a firm stance on protecting their economic sovereignty. The initial meetings were polite, but strained. Both sides laid out their grievances, with the U.S. emphasizing the need for structural reforms in China's economy, particularly regarding intellectual property rights and market access. China, in turn, called for the removal of tariffs and respect for international trade rules. The first round of talks ended without a breakthrough, but neither side was willing to back down. It was clear that this was not going to be a quick resolution. The stakes were too high, and the differences too deep. Back in Beijing, the Chinese government began to implement countermeasures. They announced tariffs on a range of American products, including soybeans, cars, and airplanes. The choice of targets was strategic, aimed at hitting key U.S. industries and regions that were politically important to President Trump. The tit-for-tat continued, with each side trying to outmaneuver the other. Markets reacted with volatility as investors tried to navigate the uncertain waters. Companies began to feel the impact, with some considering relocating their supply chains to avoid the tariffs. In the midst of this economic turbulence, ordinary people were also feeling the effects. Farmers in the American Midwest saw their export markets shrink, while consumers faced higher prices for goods. In China, manufacturers struggled with the increased cost of imported raw materials, and workers worried about job security. As the months went by, the realization set in that this was not just a skirmish, but a prolonged conflict. The U.S.-China trade war was reshaping the global economy, and the world watched with bated breath as the two giants clashed. As the trade war escalated, its impact began to be felt far beyond the borders of the United States and China. The global economy, intricately linked by supply chains and trade networks, started to show signs of strain. Countries around the world found themselves caught in the crossfire, with some facing economic turbulence, while others saw opportunities to capitalize on the shifting landscape. In Europe, policymakers scrambled to assess the fallout. The European Union, already dealing with internal challenges like Brexit, now faced the added pressure of navigating the trade tensions between the two largest economies. German car manufacturers, heavily reliant on both the American and Chinese markets, were particularly vulnerable. Factories in Stuttgart and Munich watched nervously as tariffs threatened to disrupt their finely tuned operations. In Japan, another economic heavyweight, the situation was equally complex. Japanese companies had substantial investments in both the US and China. As tariffs disrupted trade flows, executives in Tokyo held emergency meetings to devise strategies for mitigating the impact. The Japanese government, traditionally cautious in its diplomatic approach, sought to mediate and encourage dialogue between Washington and Beijing, but their efforts were met with limited success. Meanwhile, emerging economies felt the shockwaves in different ways. In Southeast Asia, countries like Vietnam and Malaysia saw a surge in interest from companies looking to relocate their manufacturing operations. The prospect of becoming alternative hubs for production brought both excitement and challenges. Governments in these nations worked to improve infrastructure and attract foreign investment, hoping to benefit from the trade realignment. India, with its massive market and growing economy, also found itself at a crossroads. The Indian government saw an opportunity to strengthen its economic ties with both the US and China. Prime Minister Narendra Modi launched initiatives to boost manufacturing and attract investment, positioning India as a potential beneficiary of the trade war. However, balancing relations with both superpowers required careful diplomacy. In Africa, the effects were mixed. Countries that had developed strong trade relationships with China, such as Kenya and Ethiopia, worried about reduced demand for their exports. On the other hand, Some African nations saw the possibility of attracting investment from Chinese companies seeking to circumvent U.S. tariffs. The African Union called for unity and strategic planning to navigate the new economic reality.